Professional footballers live in a very specific kind of reality, an insulated one. For years, everything is handled for them. Food is prepared, schedules are managed, problems are solved before they fully appear. Their only real job is to perform. It's a clean, controlled environment. But interestingly, this kind of reality doesn't only exist in football, but in many parts of our society. Welcome to Look Again, the channel where we do not tell you what is true, but where we question what you accept and assume to be true. This insulated environment is not only the case of footballers, but any high-level athletes or sportsmen. It is not accidental, it is built. If someone is valuable in a specific role, you want to remove any friction around them. You make sure nothing interferes, nothing distracts, nothing pulls them out of focus so they can deliver results. And over time, something subtle happens. The environment becomes invisible to the individual. It no longer feels like support, it feels like reality. For a professional footballer, this can mean 10, 15, maybe 20 years, and then it ends, usually in their late 30s, unless they continue their career in management and essentially in the industry. And when it does end, the shift can be very sharp, because the structure that carried everything quietly disappears. Now the same person who operated at the highest level has to deal with things that were never really part of their daily experience. Small decisions, unfiltered feedback, unstructured life. And for some, that transition is difficult enough that they seek help to make sense of it. Not because something is suddenly broken, but because something they relied on is no longer there. And that is why in many cases they seek a professional help of a psychologist to help steer their life back to actual reality. Now, this raises a question whether the difficulty was created at the end or only revealed at the end. Now, you might be asking, how does this all pertain to women? And unless you have already seen the way how we are structuring it, you might have already perceived where we are going. But many women grow up and move through the world in an environment that also adjusts around them. From a very young age, signals are reinforced. They are encouraged, affirmed, supported again and again from parents, peers, teachers, and later from men who have their own reasons to agree, to impress, to maintain access, from social circles that reward certain images, from workplaces that avoid friction rather than create it. The DEI and women for power, etc., all of these instill a certain image. The media continues, the legislature, everywhere they look, they are being shielded from reality, from the truth. So the feedback in this world becomes consistent. Not identical, but consistent enough. And over time, the consistency stops feeling like feedback. It just feels like truth. Now compare that to the footballer. He lives in a constructed reality, but he had a real life before it, and eventually he will leave this constructed reality. At some point, there will come a moment that something pushes back, something doesn't adjust, something doesn't reinforce, something that was there suddenly isn't anymore. And that contrast becomes impossible to ignore, and they will be forced to face it. But what if someone doesn't experience that contrast in the same way, or not as early, or actually very late? If reinforcement continues, if it was always there from the very young age and continues through their 20s, 30s, and even beyond, then what exactly are they comparing their reality to? If most feedback has always pointed in one direction, how would a different signal even register? And if an image has been consistently supported by all the layers around them, what would it take to question it? Because at that point, it's no longer just about belief, it's about familiarity, about what has always been reflected back. So when we see someone resist criticism, dismiss certain feedback, or hold tightly to a particular version of themselves, what are we actually looking at? A personal choice? Or a pattern that has never really been interrupted? Because one environment like the professional sports is easy to recognize. It's structured, visible, obvious. But in case of women, it's harder to see because it doesn't look controlled. It just feels normal for them. And if that kind of environment can shape how someone sees themselves for years without it being questioned, then where exactly does that leave the line between perception and reality? And how would anyone know if they had never really stepped outside of it? And maybe this is where the difference becomes more visible. A footballer eventually reaches a point where something doesn't work anymore. The structure is gone, the feedback changes, the environment no longer adjusts, and for some that moment is clear enough, and they, as we mentioned, will seek help. Not because they became incapable, but because something they relied on quietly disappeared. So they try to understand it. They try to make sense of what changed. But if we compare that to the situation of a modern woman, where that kind of interruption doesn't happen, where the environment continues to reinforce, continues to adjust, continues to reflect the same signals back. Happy wife, happy life. The woman is always right. Year after year, day after day. If there's no clear moment where something breaks, no sharp contrast, no obvious shift, then what exactly would trigger that same kind of reflection? What would signal that something needs to be re-examined? Because if most experiences continue to confirm the same pattern, then questioning it wouldn't feel naturally. It might not even appear as an option, and if that's the case, then the absence of doubt itself becomes interesting, not as a flaw, but as a continuation of the same environment, the same reinforcement, the same consistency. So when we talk about people struggling later on, or reacting strongly to certain kinds of feedback, or holding tightly to a particular version of themselves, what are we actually looking at? A refusal to face something? Or a reality that was never really challenged in the first place? Because one path forces that confrontation eventually, the other might not. And if that difference alone can shape how someone relates to reality over time, then the question shifts again, not just about the individual, but about the conditions that had formed them. What gets reinforced, what gets softened, what gets avoided, and how early that starts. Because if someone never really encounters resistance, never has to question the signals they receive, never experiences a clear contrast, then what exactly are they learning to trust? And if that pattern continues across years, across environments, across relationships, then what does facing reality even mean in that context? Is it something you choose, or something you're eventually forced into? And maybe the question doesn't stop at the individual, because individuals never form in isolation. They form inside environments that consistently shape what feels normal, what feels acceptable, and what feels true. And this is where it stops even being about one group or another group and becomes something wider. Because in many environments today, there is a growing instinct to reduce friction, to soften difficult moments, to delay discomfort, to filter what somebody has to face directly. Not in one place, but across many. In how people are raised, how they are spoken to, in how conflict is handled or avoided. And on the surface, it might feel like care, it might feel like protection, but over time, something subtle begins to shift. Because if every sharp edge is softened, if every uncomfortable signal is buffered, then the first real encounter with resistance doesn't arrive gradually anymore. It arrives suddenly, fully formed, and very discomforting. And the individual not used to deal with any kind of adversity reacts usually with a massive emotional turmoil or a tantrum, which raises a quieter question underneath it all, not about intention but about the outcome. What does it say about a society that consistently dumps all the pressure on one part of its populace so it can protect the other part from friction, rather than letting them learn how to move through it? Not to abandon support, not to remove guidance, but to question whether removing every form of resistance, every form of discomfort, actually prepares someone for a world that will not behave the same way. And if it doesn't, then the question stops being about groups or individuals and it becomes about what is being shaped in the background through repetition, through reinforcement, through what is allowed to be experienced, and what is consistently softened before it is felt. Because in that sense, what someone believes about themselves and what they are never allowed to test can slowly become the same thing. And when that happens, truth doesn't arrive as clarity. It arrives as a form of dissonance. And dissonance is rarely experienced calmly, because when something that was always softened suddenly becomes unavoidable, the reaction is not gradual understanding, it is a sharp interruption. And if that reaction is always strongest when something arrives late, why was the expectation shaped that it would never arrive at all?